Hello everyone, welcome back to our Through the Bible study. We left off in Genesis chapter 21 where we were discussing the life and legacy of Abraham. And knowing that this is not only discussing and covering a very significant figure as far as biblical narrative and history goes, but also a good example for us to understand the heart of the Father and a life that follows a relationship with God, and the promises that we're going to have therein. Because just like Abraham was shown warts and all, which gives a lot of credence, to be perfectly honest, to the Bible's legacy, that unlike any other religion, it shows its saints and heroes warts and all. But also noting this, that where Abraham made mistakes, he also got one thing right, in that he was willing to trust God at his word. And we're going to be reading about the fulfillment of 5 major promises that were given in life itself, not only in the life of Abraham, but in our lives as well. So if you can turn to the book of Genesis chapter 21, we're going to be discussing the first major principle of life that we could know first face, is that God always accomplishes his promises. And in this, we read in the first verse, this laid out to us point blank. And the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, and at the set time of which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah born to him. Note, this is important because it's really significant. Isaac. Then Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old. Why? As God commanded him. That's why. Now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made me laugh, and all who hear will laugh with me. She also said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? For I have borne him a son in his old age. So starting out this passage, we get the first promises of life, again repeated because it's important, that God is always going to fulfill his promises, not only as he said them, but according to the way that he said he'd do them. And with this in mind, you need to understand that the birth of Isaac is repeated and emphasized not only to Abraham, but from Sarah, because at this time in their life, it was an absolute miracle. Sarah was 90 plus years old at this point, and Abraham was 100. And just taking this observation and saying, from a third person perspective, not only should it not be possible for us to have children at this age, but we were never able to have children at any age. And yet God said, you think it's impossible? Watch me. And boom, baby's here. It's a boy. Exactly how and in what way he said it. And granted, there was a lot of time that was given to wait for these said promises, but if you talk to anyone in your life, your friends, your family, your elders, grandparents, you'd understand that God is either in their, if they have a relationship with God, of course, God is either working out his promises in their lives or he's already worked them out, which is why we're given these things in his word, because we could know the first promise of life. It's concrete and solid, that as God said, he will do. That God who set out to accomplish a good work in your life, he will be faithful to complete it, Philippians 1 tells us. So understanding and noting that, why did God wait so long? Again, to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt, 100%, that God was behind this. It shouldn't have been possible, and yet it all happened in the exact same way that it was said it would happen. It was an absolute miracle that Sarah was not only able to support herself, but maintain the virility to be able to nurse this child. And it basically follows that principle of bumblebee logic. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but the bumblebee is an insect that its body is so large and its wings are so small that the amount of force it should be able to perform scientifically shouldn't be able to allow itself to fly. And yet the bumblebee was never told this rule, because it doesn't care. It flies anyway, because it doesn't care what's impossible. And God follows that same logic, is he's going to do what he's going to do because he set the rules for it and he's allowed to break them. So, knowing that's a motive of encouragement in our lives itself, we move on to the second promise of life, which is also equally as encouraging. In verse 8, so the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the same day that Isaac was weaned. And again, we'll go through the entirety of the story on to verse 21. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, scoffing. So everyone laughing at the 8-day anniversary, the circumcision of Isaac and the set apart of him for God's work as God told him he would do. And Ishmael is laughing as well, but more like a teenager's laugh rather than a excited parent's laugh. And Sarah wouldn't have anything to do with it. She said in verse 10, "Therefore she said to Abraham, Cast out this bondwoman and her son. For the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, namely with Isaac." And the matter was very displeasing in Abraham's sight because of his son. But God said to Abraham, "Do not let it be displeasing in your sight because of the lad, or because of your bondwoman. Whatever Sarah has said to you, listen to her voice, for in Isaac your seed shall be called. Yet I will also make a nation of the son of the bondwoman, because he is your seed." The principles still apply to him too. It's not that Hagar and Ishmael were bad people. It was that God had a separate plan for Hagar and Ishmael, and it wouldn't be done in their house. And just like Abraham was saying, "Man, Sarah, why do you have to keep acting like Sarai?" I thought we had discussed this, that with all of these things that God was sorting out, you have to pick now on this happy day to throw these people out? I mean, that's my boy. I mean, sure, this incident with Hagar is something that we agreed a long time ago we'd never speak about again. But why be so harsh? And then it was only when God had intervened and told Abraham, "Listen to her, because there's an important lesson I want to demonstrate to you about this." That's the second principle of life. God cleanses us from our past mistakes. And that when Abraham's first major lapse of faith in regarding the conception of Ishmael, it wasn't to say that the baby's life was a mistake, but it was an active demonstration and reminder of a time and a decision that Abraham made to not trust God. And God was willing to not only personally put those things behind him, but also actively and practically still be able to take care of that life even though they represented something negative. That even though Ishmael would be the father of the Arab tribes, that same promise applied to Isaac, but in a different capacity. That just like Isaac would give birth to the nation of Israel, and through Israel would come Jacob, and through Jacob would come the 12 tribes of Israel, through Judah, the son of promise, Jesus, the miracle child born in much more miraculous terms than just being born in old age, would be a blessing to the entire world. That Ishmael would also have a promise according to God's plan, but in a different capacity. He said, "I'll take care of Ishmael and Hagar. But understand, I want you to be the living example of this second promise of life, that I'm willing to put, and actively willing to do so, mind you, to put your past mistakes behind you so that you could move closer to me." So continuing where we left off and saying that the promises of Isaac would be the only son of Abraham, in which God would use in that capacity, Abraham in verse 14 rose early in the morning, took bread and a skin of water, and putting it on her shoulder, he gave it to the boy Hagar, and sent her away. Then she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. Again, that's where she had the first run-in with the Lord. And the water in the skin was used up. And she placed the boy under one of the shrubs, and then she went and sat down across from him at a distance of about a bowshot. For she said to herself, "Let me not see the death of the boy." So she sat opposite to him, lifted her voice, and wept. So essentially, the circumstances that surrounded Abraham sending Hagar and Ishmael off. Ishmael was 13 years old at the time. Actually about 14, because a year had passed. It said when Abraham was 99, it had been 67 years since then. But essentially, their resources run out. They're wandering through the desert, and with no more water, essentially Hagar gives up all hope and just starts bawling her eyes out, freaking out as most moms would do when they realize that their baby boy's now in trouble, even though he's 13 and doesn't want to hear any of this. You could understand the circumstances in which putting distance between them was not only for Hagar's sake to not see the death of the boy, but maybe gave Ishmael some space to actually demonstrate common sense, because it says in verse 17 actually something really funny. And God heard the voice of the lad. Not Hagar and her bawling and freaking out, but you could imagine Ishmael being 14 years old, and he's like, "Oh, God, could you please make my mom shut up? We're not dying." And it gets even funnier because it says, the angel of the Lord called out to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What ails you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him with your hand, for I will make him a great nation." Again, stop doubting me. We discussed this already. I made a promise to you, I'll fulfill it. Was Isaac not proof enough? Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And when she went and filled the skin with water and gave the lad a drink, so God was with the lad, and he grew and dwelt in the wilderness. And he became an archer. And he dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife from him for the land of Egypt. So essentially what happened was she was too busy freaking out that they were out of water. She didn't notice that a well was right there. And God kind of had to snap her to attention and say, "I'm going to take care of you. Just calm down." And understand, too, it's not that we aren't prone to these flip-out moments, but it is important that we listen to the Lord during those times. Because, I mean, how humiliating is it that a teenager was more keen into the promises of God than his mom was? But with that demonstration of humility, we understand that when Ishmael was at this time in his life, it wasn't just that Abraham showed them the door, he gave them the means at which they would be able to make it to another city, that they would be able to get a fresh start, and understand that just like God fulfilled the lives of the promises of Abraham, it's important that these messages are repeated, because a good teacher always repeats himself. So let me say that again. A good teacher is always going to repeat himself. And God's saying, look, first principle of life, I'm going to fulfill my promise. Second fulfillment of life, God is always going to make sure that he puts distance between us and our past mistakes. He's going to cleanse us from our old dirty laundry. And by the way, do you remember God fulfilling your promises? I'm going to do that with your dirty laundry too. Just saying. So continuing on, we're going to move into verse 22, where we get into the third promise of life, which I'd actually like to read to you before we discuss it. "And it came to pass at the time that Abimelech and Pishkol, the commander of his army," again, these were the Philistine kings that Abraham had run into during our last study, "spoke to Abraham, saying, God is with you in all that you do. Now therefore swear to me by God that you will not deal falsely with me, with my offspring, or with my prosperity, or my posterity, my legacy. But that according to the kindness which I have done to you, you will do to me in the land which you have dwelt. Then Abraham said, I will swear. Then Abraham rebuked Abimelech because of a well of water which Abimelech's servant had seized. And Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this thing. You did not tell me, nor had I heard of it until today. So Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two of them made a covenant. And Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock by themselves. Then Abimelech asked Abraham, What is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs which you have set by themselves? And he said, You will take these 7 ewe lambs from my hand, and they may be a witness that I have dug this well. Therefore he called that place Beersheba, because the two of them swore an oath there. Thus they made a covenant at Beersheba. So Abimelech rose with Pishkol, the commander of his army, and they returned to the land of the Philistines. Then Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. Again, law of first mentions, the first time that title is mentioned as referring to God. That's an important thing to note. And Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines many days. So, noting that name Philistine should be familiar to those of you who have a childhood in VeggieTales or a legacy in biblical history, you would know that the Philistines would be great enemies of Israel during the time of not only the conquering of the land of Canaan, when the promises to the Canaanites of saying, you have a second chance, stop slaughtering each other before God has to put you down like the rabid dog you are becoming, that the same thing was also true, that just like Abimelech was, for all intents and purposes, not a friend of Abram, that when he was renamed Abraham, when the promises of God began to be fulfilled in his life, and Isaac was born to him, and they could observe from a third-person perspective and say, man, that's impressive, their God must really be real, because we worship to Dagon, we worship to Molech, we worship to Ashtoreth, and they don't do anything like that for us. If anything, just make us feel good, and I'm all partial and for that. That's all I really have to live for. But seeing this God at work in Abraham's life, I think we're going to be on good terms with them. And Abraham uses Abimelech's demonstration of common sense to say, Oh yeah, you want to be on good terms with me? Well, let's settle this account right now. You remember that well that I dug when I was staying here? And your military served it? Speaking of, Commander. And Abimelech said, I never heard anything about that. He's, basically being caught red-handed. He's saying, oh, classic politician, I don't claim any responsibility for those things that happened. My soldiers acted without my orders, I suppose. So, it's yours now, right? Draw my troops. We're good? We're all clean on this? God's not going to go all Sodom and Gomorrah on me? And Abraham, just shaking his head, said, look, here, I'll pay for it. That will be the promise and the covenant between you and me. And again, Beersheba was referring to the 7 wells, or the oath of 7. 7 meaning completion. So an absolute oath would be taken there. And then he plants tamarisk trees in Beersheba to basically say, I'm going to settle down here. Because it wasn't just saying, I plant a tree as a testament. It's just like one tree and saying, bam, this is where I'm staying. No, he planted a grove. And he had been carrying a lot of these things, implying that he wanted to create shade, he wanted to create a more fertile environment and a place where him and his family could stay for a while. And it says that in verse 34, that's where Abraham stayed for a while. But knowing that this is the third promise of life, we need to recognize and understand that honoring God may not prevent you from having enemies. That just like Abimelech was a site and source of one of Abraham's major mistakes, and that facing the consequences of such was going to be a moment of embarrassment for him, you also need to understand that when you honor God, it may not prevent you from having enemies. Again, I repeat these points because it's important, but it will put distance between you and them. The Philistines would not be good on this oath. They would not remember the orders of their king to be on good terms with Abraham and his children, specifically referring to Isaac and Jacob. But it would imply that for the time being, God would put distance between the two of them in regards to the fact that as Abraham honored God, God essentially had the sword drawn and saying, you want to touch my servant? The closer they are to me, the more you're messing with me. And note, it doesn't mean that the more distance we put between ourselves and God implies that his promises don't necessarily apply, but they can't be fully received as if we were closer to him. We can't enjoy God and his benefits if we're not enjoying him and just who he is. And when Abraham was in a good place in his life, essentially the principle stood. So I stand with God, he stands with me. When I draw near to God, he draws near to me. This is a promise that's consistent in the entirety of Scripture. So understand, God put distance between him and his enemies. It's not that we won't have enemies. Jesus said, pray for your enemies. That implies you're going to have some. Jesus said, love your enemies. Pray for those who despitefully use you. That would imply that you will have some. But as you follow God, you're literally going against the grain of the majority of people in this world. But also understanding that the closer you are to God, the further away they'll want to be from you, because the closer you are to light, the more the people of darkness will keep their distance. It's when we start backsliding and heading the other direction that we tend to get into trouble. And we understand the time the Philistines gave Israel the most trouble was during the time of Judges. And that was also during the time when Israel was the farthest it had ever been in its relationship with God. Note it would get progressively worse into the time of Kings when they'd finally go into captivity. But we'll discuss those when we get into that book. So understand that the wisdom, as much as the grace that's going to be shown here, wisdom is the application of knowledge. You know who and who you don't want interaction with, but also understanding the mercy that needs to be shown to you is the same you want to show to them. Abraham didn't have to buy back this field. He wanted to make sure it was rock solid. And that's, again, the third promise of life here. He's going to honor God, and his enemies will honor him by leaving him alone. That's an important thing to remember, is if you have bullies or people that you just don't get along with, the closer you follow God, the farther they'll be following you. So going into chapter 22, it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. Then he said, Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Here's the fourth promise of life. God's going to sometimes ask us to do things that don't make sense to us at the time. The law of first mentions is something that we've discussed on multiple occasions in our study through Genesis thus far. And again, for those of you who weren't or don't remember the times we mentioned this in our previous studies, the law of first mentions means that when something is brought up in Scripture for the first time in its entirety, you would then use that as essentially the staple stereotype as which you would judge the use of that term throughout the rest of Scripture. So when God says, "Take your son, your only son whom you love," not only is he missing a detail here and saying, wait, Ishmael was born to Abraham, that's his biological son. Don't you think that God would know that Abraham had another kid? Of course he did, but understand, God doesn't recognize the deeds of our flesh. When we're in a saving relationship with him, he doesn't even regard our mistakes as though they even existed anymore. And that's encouraging news. But then it goes on to say, "Your only son, Isaac, whom you love." And that's what I want to put the emphasis on right now. That love is the first time that this word is mentioned in the entire Bible. And how convenient then would it be that the first time love is mentioned in the Bible, and the standard at which we should draw back and understand that when God says God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that same love he had for us would be the same love that a father had for his only son. Now again, when we discussed last week's study concerning the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham got a chance to be an example of God's heart in regards to a sinful and fallen world, that though it is fair, righteous, and just for him to just smite us all, that he relates to us through mercy and love because he doesn't want to see us judged. He's willing to do anything to mediate for us and to redeem us and call us out of the consequences of our mistakes while there's still time to do so. And Abraham got to be a living example and illustration of that. But now he's getting another chance to be a more literal and direct example of what the love of the Father was going to be like, in that the Father himself would one day do the very same thing on the very same mountain. Now, the mountain Moriah is literally just outside the region, and in fact a part of the region that makes up the city of Jerusalem. And the very tip of that mountain, the highest point, is known as Golgotha, or Calvary. And that term, meaning hill of the skull, is the location geographically, historically, and biblically where Jesus was crucified. And now God's saying, "Take your only son Isaac and offer him up to me on Mount Moriah." In the book of Romans, when we get into it, Paul the Apostle is going to discuss the doctrinal point that God was intending to make through all of this. That just as Abraham's life was meant to be a living example of someone who trusted God, to be the pioneer in the way of someone enjoying a relationship with the true and living God. And note, there were others before him. There was Enoch, there was Seth, there was Adam after he made his mistake. And there were many other individuals, including Job, who was alive during the time of Abraham, but understanding that he was included in posterity for a reason. That when Abraham was given a living example, his name itself, meaning father of many nations, would be an active example of the Father's heart. When he would do this, he was still human. That he had essentially a decision to make. He could either trust God when it didn't make sense, including that being one of the promises of life, that we will be called to trust God even when it doesn't make sense to us. But that even more so and more importantly, Paul the Apostle goes on in the book of Romans to say he essentially had his faith tested to the highest point it had ever been in his life. That if God made a promise, again, cycle back to Hagar and Ishmael, "Hagar, I'm going to bless your son. There are going to be many nations from him. We're out of water. Oh, God, you've abandoned us. We're going to die. And then Ishmael's like, "God, please shut her up." Yeah, you understand that point. Abraham trusted God to fulfill his promise. Not only was Isaac's birth living enough proof that God was going to do not only what he said, but how he said he'd do it. But even more so and more importantly, Abraham says, all right, God, you got a problem here. If you want me to give Isaac up to you to participate in human sacrifice, because, I mean, you're God. It's your business what you do with living beings. You gave us life. You're ultimately the one who decides when we get to take it. If you're going to create a nation out of him, and he's dead, because note, Isaac was around late 20s, early 30s at this time. This is the young lad, the same translation for his 2 adult servants that were ministering to him as well. If he's dead and doesn't have any children, then you're either going to have to resurrect him from the dead, or something really weird is going to happen here, because you fulfill your promises. Cycle back to the first promise in life. How then are you going to make a nation out of him if you don't resurrect him from the dead? So Abraham rose early in the morning, verse 3 of chapter 22, and saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son. He split the wood for the burnt offering, arose, and went to the place which God had told him. Abraham's going to trust God. May not make sense, but he trusts him. He hasn't been wrong this far. Now verse 4, recognize another similitude to the life of Jesus. Then on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. Now note, that word worship, it's not referring to they're going to go up there and sing. It's not referring to they're going to go up there and build a church and then attend service, and they're going to have some guy in the local band or something. Maybe Melchizedek's still there. He can lead service. No. To worship means literally to bow down, to recognize who someone is. And with Abraham essentially laying his son's life in God's hands, just like God was the one who gave Isaac life in the first place, beyond any means or circumstances that should have been possible, Abraham said, we're going to go and bow down to God. And nothing can be further from the truth. That's exactly what they did. So, and that's also another interesting thing. Abraham made the claim, we will come back to you. So Abraham, verse 6, took the wood and the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the 2 of them went together. So essentially, Isaac is carrying the wood that he himself would be killed on up the mountain. This is fun. But Isaac spoke to Abraham, his father, and said, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. Then he said, look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, my son, you ready for this? God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. So the 2 of them went together. God will provide himself a sacrifice. Little did Abraham know he was prophesying in that moment. He wouldn't ask for someone else to die for their sins. He would personally be the sacrifice that would redeem the earth. It wasn't enough that God sent his son to die for us, but we need to understand the Father and the Son are both God. God provided himself. It wasn't that Jesus, the Father, and the Holy Spirit both were drawing straws and saying, okay, who's going to redeem mankind? Jesus drew the short stick, and now he's off to redeem mankind. No, Jesus volunteered for the process. And he was already aware of this being the reality by giving Abraham the opportunity to understand what his heart was, not only with Sodom and Gomorrah and the redemption that he would imply there and saving the world from the judgment it was due, but how he would do so. So they came to the place which God had told them, and Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order. And he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. Now understand, the way this is presented in movies, TV shows, has been a traumatic and colossal failure. Because understanding that Isaac was full adulthood right now. He wasn't married, but late 20s, early 30s, the same age, by the way, that Jesus went up. He could have resisted his father. He was 100 years old, for crying out loud. I mean, there was at any time that Isaac could have resisted his father, and he said, all right, son, starts tying him up. Isaac could have gone, hey, Dad, you're kind of, what are you doing? Going senile, I'm out of here. No, Isaac let his father bind him. He let his father place him on the altar, and knowing full well that he could have resisted any time, trusted his father as much as he himself trusted God. And that's an important thing to note, because it was when Abraham was ready to go through with what God told him to do, the angel of the Lord, and there's that theophany again, that appearance of God himself, called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And so he said, here I am. And he said, do not lay your hand on the lad, or do anything to him, for now I know you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Note that me is referring to God himself. So who else could be speaking this? It's an important thing to note that it wasn't enough that God's voice came down from heaven, but the language actually suggests that God physically and actively stopped Abraham's hand as it was coming down and saying, okay, I see that you trust me. Now, doesn't God know everything, past, present, and future? Doesn't he know that Abraham trusted God? Doesn't he know that he would have gone through this? So why did he have to go through it at all? Understand, this was meant to be an illustration of one day what the Father himself would go through for us. Not only to lay his son's life down as a sacrifice for our sins, but understand the heartache in knowing there was no other way. Same thing is also true. Abraham said, God, you gave me this son, and if you're asking me to give him back to you, I trust you to not only fulfill your promises, but even more so and more importantly, to do so in a way where there would be no other way. If you're going to have to perform a miracle, then do it. But he's already belonging to you. You were the one who gave him to me. You asked for him back, I'll do it. And God said, Abraham, I know that you trust me now. So didn't God already know? Yes, but understand, we need to know this. That even in the times where it makes no sense for us to trust God, understand we may be sharing God's heart in more ways than we realize. So, this undeniable foreshadowing to Jesus in the future. For 3 days, Abraham just wouldn't talk to Isaac. He was considered all but dead to him. The same location where the father would give up his son, but also most importantly to understand that the lamb was what they were referring to as far as what would be the sacrifice. And Jesus is known as the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, noted in all 3 Gospels in the exclusion of the 4. And in John it goes in even more detail as to the significance as such. But going on and continuing, understanding that Abraham's faith was genuine, that we need to understand this test of faith did prove 3 things. I'm mentioning this multiple times because it's important. Abraham's faith was genuine. He believed God would make a great nation. This was important. God wasn't asking Abraham to do anything that he himself not only deserved but was willing to go through himself. But then most importantly, he didn't let Abraham go through with it. He personally would fulfill this revelation of a father's love, giving up his son for the world, just to show how unimaginably strong the Father's love is for each and every one of us. That the thing that was most precious to him, he would not withhold from us if it meant redeeming us. So, knowing that Abraham was certainly blessed through his obedience, we know that this is a common principle of life. No, not one of the promises of life, but one nonetheless, because God renews his promise for the first time to be called a provider in the context of someone who they thought they had already lost everything. God returned it to them even more wonderfully than before, because Abraham said, I'm going to lose my boy. one way or another. Either God's going to raise him from the dead or something else is going to happen here. But I've lost my boy. The moment they started walking up that mountain, he knew there was no going back. And yet he told his servants, we will be back. The obedience that he received through blessing wasn't just the fact that he knew that everything he had been given in life had ultimately come from God, but that the things that he ultimately gave up to God, he never really lost, did he? God just wanted to see if he was willing to be blessed even more so than he already had. Because what more of a blessing could he have than getting a son when his body was considered dead? Try a son he thought was already dead and seeing him risen from the dead in his heart and mind. Note, he didn't have to kill him, but understand God gave him back to him. And you could know for a fact that Abraham was thankful for that. That he appreciated the time he had with Isaac even more so. And understanding as well in verse 13, he said he lifted up his eyes and looked, and there was a ram caught behind a thicket in its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it for a burnt offering instead of his son. And God called the name of this place, the Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. And provided it was. Now, the angel of the Lord called to Abraham, verse 13, and a second time out of heaven, and said, By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing. I have not withheld your son, your only son. Blessing I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven, and as the sand of which is on the seashore, and your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. And in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they rose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham dwelt at Beersheba. So again, not only was Abraham renewed to his blessing and promise by God, but now got an opportunity to be even more blessed as the result of what would happen. Because, as you recall, Abraham still had extended family members, and this news only kept getting better. In verse 20, Now it came to pass after these things that it was told Abraham, saying, Indeed, Milcah, who was his older brother, also has borne children to your brother Nahor. Nahor was his older brother. Milcah, sorry about that, his wife. Huz his firstborn, Buz his brother, Kemuel the father of Aram, Chesed, Hazo, Padesh, Jileth, Bethuel, and Bethuel begot Rebekah. Remember that name for later. And these 8 Milcah born to Nahor, Abraham's brother, his concubine, whose name was Remuah, bore Teba, Gaham, Tanasha, and Ma'acha. Either way. Rebekah is going to play a very interesting role in our next study, and knowing that it was essentially a fourth cousin to Abraham. His older brother had essentially said, Hey, Abraham, you got your son back from the dead. Guess what? We got good news. You got some nephews, too. And that's important to note. When you obey God, you not only get the blessing of understanding the revelation of his character and how good he is, but he'll throw in some extra, too. That he now has 8 new nephews. And imagine how much more happy he was, not only knowing that he still has his son, but now has even more kids to enjoy and get to meet. So, continuing with these first 4 promises of life. God will always fulfill his promises, exactly in the way he said them and by the means at which he said he will do them. Second promises of life. God will cleanse us from our past mistakes. We saw that with Hagar and Ishmael. And also repeating that promise to them, saying, I promised I would make you a great nation. I'm going to take care of you. Stop crying. The third promise of life. God and following him may not keep us from having enemies, but it will put distance between us and them. The fourth promise of life. God will call us to trust him even when it won't make sense to us at the time. But the fifth and the most dramatic and tragic, sadly, of life's promises. It ends. Chapter 23. Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. So Sarah died in Kirjath Arabah, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Then Abraham stood up from before his dead and spoke to the sons of Heth, saying, I am a foreigner and a visitor among you. Give me property for a burial place among you, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. And the sons of Heth answered Abraham, saying to him, Hear us, my lord, you are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our burial places. None of us will withhold from you this burial place, that you may bury your dead. Then Abraham stood up and bowed himself to the people of the land, the sons of Heth, and he spoke with them, saying, If it is your wish that I bury my dead out of my sight, hear me, and meet with Ephron the son of Zohar for me, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he has, which is at the end of his field. Let him give it to me at it the full price, as a property for a burial place among you. Now Ephron dwelt among the sons of Heth, and Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the presence of the sons of Heth, all who entered the gate of the city, and saying, No, my lord, hear me. I give you the field and the cave that is in it. Take it for free. I give it to you in the presence of the sons of my people, and give it to you to bury your dead. Then Abraham bowed himself down before the people of the land, and he spoke to Ephron in the hearing of the people, saying, This is all public. If you will give it, please hear me. I will give you the money for the field. Take it from me. I will bury my dead there. So, essentially, this point is being emphasized. Not all the news was good. 8 new nephews, his sons, symbolically returned to Abraham from the dead. But Sarah, his wife, has died from old age, and he just wanted to properly mourn her and bury her there. He was tired of looking at a corpse. He wanted to put her to rest so that he could move on with his life and understand this is a natural part of what life is all about. Understanding that just like we get and gain people, we also lose people. It's not how we lose them or why, but it's just knowing what we're going to do with the lessons that they taught us. So he wants to properly respect Sarah. And continuing just briefly on to the rest of this chapter, I want to finish it up for you guys for time's sake. Ephron answered Abraham, saying to him, My lord, listen to me. The land is worth 400 shekels. So that's about $4,000 in our accounting today of silver. But what is that between you and me? So bury your dead. Saying, oh, well, it costs this exorbitantly hyped up price that the land's not even worth, even if you bought my own house and territory. But I'll give it to you for free. So essentially, I don't know how many of you guys are accustomed to Middle Eastern culture, but they love to haggle. And it's almost like a game to them. When you go in the marketplaces, it's a competition between you and them to see, like, they'll name some outrageous price, like essentially the vending machines at Disneyland, where you're like, hey, this water bottle, it's $4, but I'll give it to you for 75, or I'll give it to you for $4. And the other person says, are you kidding me? I had a water bottle in here. I could go to Safeway right now and order it for 50 cents. And he's saying, okay, well, what if I give it to you for $3? And he's saying, did you not hear what I just said? I say it's 75 cents. And essentially going Pinkie Pie and is saying it's 2 bits, 1 bit, 1 bit, 2 bits in the Bugs Bunny style thing. But Abraham not being in the mood for this right now. In verse 16, he said, he listened to Ephron, weighed out the silver for Ephron, which he named in the hearing of sons of Heth, 400 shekels of silver, the currency of the merchants. So the field of Ephron was in Machpelah, there I go again, which was before Mamre, the field and the cave which was in it, and the trees that were in the field, all which were in the surrounding borders were deeded to Abraham as a possession in the presence of the sons of Heth, before all who went into the gate of the city. And after this Abraham buried Sarah his wife, and in the cave of the field of Machpelah, before Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. So the field and the cave, that is what it were deeded to Abraham by the sons of Heth as a property for the burial place. Now note, the book of Genesis was written and dictated to Moses at a time when Israel would need to know this, because understanding the geographical and cultural things that they could call out, they could say, look, in history, you could find your archives and know that our ancestor Abraham bought this land from you, and that we have a right to be there. Now noting they didn't acknowledge this, but then when Israel would be occupying the land and then reading this thing from a third-person perspective and from hindsight would go, oh, okay, well, now we know where Sarah was buried. A lot of legacies, a lot of history, a lot of geographical information as far as where Sarah's tomb was, but understanding the most important things that we could take away from this in our lives today, whether you're Jewish or not, these things apply to you just as much as your legacy and family history. Is the promises of life. Again, one, God always fulfills his promises. When you're in a life that honors a relationship with God, he will fulfill exactly what he's told to you. God cleanses us from our past mistakes. Understand, when he says you're forgiven, and you don't need to waste time thinking of how to cope with or coexist with your sin. You can get rid of it. He has given you the power to do so. God puts distance between us and our enemies. Understand that when we are sharing the gospel, people aren't going to like it. That doesn't mean the way you're sharing the gospel is the wrong way. When we get into the book of Acts and the ministry of Paul the Apostle, he's going to make more enemies than, honestly, we'd ever imagine a Christian ever having. And yet, God supported him every step of the way, because when he didn't compromise and the world asked him to, that created tension. That's the most important thing we could remember. It's not that we don't have enemies, but that we're peacemakers, not peace enforcers. We're not pacifists. But we understand that as much as depends on us, live peaceably with all men. And that just means a lack of conflict. If they're going to be sour apples, then just avoid them. If you can become friends with them, you've defeated your enemy, as Abraham Lincoln said. But the most important thing to understand is the closer you are to God, the further away and the further influence your enemies will truly have over your lives. Fourth, God calls us to trust him even when it doesn't make sense, clearly demonstrated in the life of Abraham, and also understanding the life of ours concerning our salvation. If you will resurrect me from the dead one day, and I don't understand the means, how does one man not only being tortured but dying redeem me from an eternity in spiritual hell and actually vindicate me in the eyes of God? I don't know. But I trust you. You said it, you'll do it. Implying the first promise. Implying the third promise. Continuing. Also understanding that just as all of these things culminate to that one fifth and great promise of life, that it ends. What then is life without God? It's just one cycle of misery after another. If Abraham was called to give up his son, there would be no hope. If Abraham had God, he had hope of resurrection, knowing that God could raise him from the dead. So he did so not necessarily joyfully, but with hope. And understanding that the ultimate promise of life, death, is meaningless, because Abraham served a God who raised the dead, who fulfilled his promises, and who gives us the same promise. That though we will all die, and I say that as an absolute equation, whether God comes down for us or we go to him, whether the last things we see in this life are the fluorescent lights of the ceiling at a hospice center on our deathbeds, or the words GMC and a truck grill coming at our face, whether we're shot in the street by a terrorist, whether we're beheaded, or whether we simply succumb to old age, disease, or the decay of time. Death is life's promise, but understand that God is life's source, and if you have him, then 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verses 55 through 57, which I will read to you now, have all the more a beautiful meaning. O death, where is your sting? O Hades, suffering, where is your victory? The sting of death is sin, and the strength of sin is the law. But thanks be to God, who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Understand, for each and every one of you, whether you're Christian or not, if you have Jesus Christ, you have hope. And if you have received it, know it. Know that God fulfills his promises. He who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. But if you don't, understand your life will only go from heartache to tragedy in that cycle and order, with a few good moments in between, at best. But just as the life that we have and the promises that we are given therein are only narrowed down to two options, either you have the source or you don't, I implore you, choose Jesus today. If you have him, you have all that you need, and death is meaningless, because just as he rose from the dead, so too will we, by his promises and his word. And we have all the way in the book of Genesis those promises repeated. But if you don't have him, I can offer you no comfort, but simply the encouragement to go with the system that has proven itself successful before. So, thank you for your time. We will continue in Genesis chapter 24 next week. I encourage you guys to read ahead, where we will be discussing the life and legacy of Isaac, but I also want to thank you for taking the time to listen to this study. If you want to encourage the ministry, leave a like and subscribe. We'll be doing more so in the future. We got a lot of Bible to go through, so I can guarantee there will be more. Unless the promise of life fulfills itself and I die, but that's another thing that I don't have to worry about. You can. You have that option. Well, understand the promises of life, and also understand the one who gave us life made us a similar promise, that he who believes in the name of his Son will be saved. Saved from what? The strength of the law, the power of sin, and the ultimate promise of life having any power over us, but simply be a means to bring us to his arms. Thank you for your time listening to this study, and remember, Jesus loves you.